Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns. This is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee, using the 2021 translation I did with Dr. Nancy Turner, published by Ouroboros Press. First thing, if you think you have seen this video before, you probably have. This is a redo because in my last video on Theorem 10, I made a significant mispronunciation where I, instead of saying Yeshua said Jehovah Shah. Now, if you've seen it already, there is a note on that other video that you saw at the bottom saying, hey, substitute this word for the other. It's very important since that is the word. But I also thought I'll just redo this so at least I have one version of this video that is correct, where I'm not stumbling over words. So class 10, theorem 10, welcome. We're going to talk about the kingdom. That is the word used for the Sephira Malkuth, the earth on which you stand, the manifest physical universe. If you've seen this screen before, you know the spiel. There have been previous videos all the way through the letter to Maximillian, to the printer, the first 10 theorems. This is not the place to jump in. Please go back and see those videos. We've looked at this in terms of cosmogenic text, the Bible and Genesis, Plato's Timaeus, which is the Pythagorean creation of the universe through forms, and you need to understand those contexts before jumping in here. Dee is taking apart this symbol, his monad glyph of everything, and putting it back together. One thing I haven't talked about, though, a lot is when he says he's explaining these 24 theorems mathematically, magically, kabbalistically, and anagogically. What does he mean by magic? His ideas of magic come directly out of Kabbalah, and yes, they will link ahead to his later angel magic. So let's see if we can answer that by the time this is finished. We already looked at Theorem 10. I won't read through the whole thing in terms of what we've talked about before, except to remind you where we ended. We ended talking about the dodecatemorion of Aries, this way of breaking up the zodiac, 12 signs, not in the modern way where you have decads of that sign, but an older way where you go by the first 12, then the second 12, and so on. Aries is the first sign. The way that they measure the year then is that it begins on the spring equinox. Aries is the first sign. So this is Aries of Aries. It's a flash of initiatory fire. We also saw the sharp edge and pointed form that we have associated previously with the beginning of creation, Stilbon and Mercury. There's a whole video talking about what is Mercury below, but it can be the Mercury of the philosophers. It can also be the Big Bang that creates the universe. It can be the puncture of the perfect sphere that in the Timaeus you go from then this giant sphere of perfect forms that is eternal and doesn't change through the receptacle that captures their image somehow into a world of constant motion, a world of becoming. Now, Dee will say he needs a ministry of fire down here, and sure enough, Aries is associated with fire. It's one of the three fire signs, and he's talking about astronomical signs. So Aries, Sagittarius, Leo. This fire at the bottom looks like what the physical alchemists are going to do in the Athenor, right? Fire things so that you can transform some physical thing, lead into gold. But that implies motion. In fact, the zodiac implies motion. So there's a problem here. In the world of perfect forms, nothing moves. The forms are eternal. Now, I realize there's a built-in contradiction in that fire can just change into air or change into water because they're all made of the same kind of triangle. So the thought there is that that triangle itself doesn't change in the Timaeus. And to ponder that more is why people have for 2,000 years talked about the Timaeus. But in any case, if we're in the world of becoming, it seems, because time has started, we've had the Big Bang, last video, that we need to separate things out. So this is where I said in the last video, you flip the monad upside down. Now you have fire in the top. You have the lightning flash down the tree, which will have 10 Sephiroth. Up to this point, our denarian proportion, or 10, has been mainly associated with the Tetrahedrons or with numbers that begin in like 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, something like that. So with the Tetractus, every side adds up to 10. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is 10. Plus there's 10 dots. The top is a monad, and that is basically a higher order decad, or a decad is a lower order monad, but it's a fractal form that you can expand out and out and out. You can also look at the 10 Sephiroth as a denarian proportion, and that's what we are going to do. The one time I taught this class in person, a couple people asked me how I thought to flip the monad. Well, talking about this 50 times or more with my husband, and he was the one that actually came up with the idea. It's like, oh, if you turn that upside down, there's your tree. Oh, yeah. Also, we had wondered, both of us, why on the Frankfurt edition you see this flipped monad. There's no explanation. It's just a picture on the last page, as if somebody has dropped in some kind of textual aid there. Like, you need something to spur your contemplation on this form? Flip it and see what happens. So that's the background on that. I have a video below arguing why I think that Dee did picture Kabbalah in a way similar to that used by Hermetic Kabbalists today. It's because he had access, I'm certain, to the Porte Lucis. This is a Latinized translation of Joseph ben Gicatia's greatest work. Gicatia was a student of the famous Spanish Kabbalist Abraham Abulafia, and I've talked about all of that in another video. There are a few differences here, right? Like these side paths from Hod or from Netzach to Malkuth don't exist. This path usually associated with the letter Pe, it's not over here. This path isn't here either. You could even imply a dot here. In fact, you can run through the whole 11th theorem and look at that as dot if you want. I'm not going to because we've got limited time. But if you have studied Hermetic Kabbalah, you will find this tree very, very similar, almost the same as the one you've been using. All right, so once flipped, the monad is going to direct us to the Kabbalah story of creation if we already know it. Remember in an earlier video, I was telling you about some of these other systems Dee was using. Like, how does he expect you just to learn it so fast? Well, he doesn't. He's using the monad as a mnemonic device, thinking that you already know it. And this is a way of remembering and transforming correspondences between them in this kind of numeric echo chamber that is the study of numbers, a very Pythagorean study of numbers to Dee. So that's why you have me to explain this, because now it is a pretty difficult assumption to think, okay, somebody knows and can visualize the Timaeus, they can know and can visualize the Kabbalah, they know every verse of the Bible, and it's kind of like a Milton's Paradise Lost, a much more tedious text in many ways. You can't read it anymore without the footnotes, but Dee is assuming you already have the Kabbalah pictured in your mind. Also in Dee's time, the correspondences between the numbers he sees sort of reverberating all over the place, and Pythagoreanism are nothing new in the very rarefied world of educated white guys in Europe. It's a small, small world, but if you are an educated humanist and you're reading what other people are writing, you know these things. Most people can't read, okay? But if you're in this intellectual elite, you've seen this kind of thing before. If you are interested in knowing Dee's Latinized Hebrew sources, I'd recommend this book. Let me get it up there where you can see it. It's Robertson Watson's book on John Dee's library catalog. I'll also mention it below. But they note that in the couple of years before writing this, Dee is going around collecting Hebrew grammars. Dee, of course, 2 years before the Hieroglyphic Monad, writes his compendious table of Hebrew Kabbalah, which sounds like he is, from those Hebrew grammars, making Kabbalistic tables of associations, because we'll see that one way Kabbalah works as a mnemonic device is you have clusters around a particular sephira of other meanings. So how does this relate to an idea of magic? Well, it's a direct link to his later Enochian work, especially the Liber Logaeth, the speech of angels, basically, that it's written down by Dee but scribed by Edward Kelly. How is this a direct link? Because what you do if you are practicing Kabbalah, rather than just reading about it, is you're contemplating upon a sephira in the same way that a Pythagorean would contemplate a number, or a Neoplatonist would contemplate perfect form. You're contemplating, let's say, Tifereth associated with the sun and all of its associations, and asking for revelation. Not only that, but it's a revelatory practice. So it becomes angel magic, what's associated angels, archangels, choirs of angels, so on. So we're going to go through the first 10 theorems and see how these numbers relate to the creation of the first 10 Sephiroth. Before I do that, I want to have a word, all puns intended, on the word tetragrammaton. So we've talked a lot about the tetractys, but the tetragrammaton, an important quaternary, Yod He Vav He, is often written out like this. Why would that be? Remember when I talked about the Voarchidumia of Pantheus and how Dee was really interested in where Panteo was going through and titling up things like the will of God equaling 72? Well, if you total up using the Hebrew correspondence of like Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, and so on, because there's a direct association in Hebrew between a letter and a number. So you get the correct number for these letters, add up every side adds up to 72. That is a wow if you're a Pythagorean, because 72 is such a significant number. Now it's important in Kabbalism, it's the number of the Shem Hem Foresh. That's the reason it's so important. If you're John Dee, and most of the books in your library, and most being, there's still tons of books on other things, but most are, the largest categories are astronomy and astrology. And you've studied the stars, you've written 120 theorems, often viewed as a guide to navigation under the stars. So you know that if you look up at, say, the North Star, how many years will it take it to move 1 degree? 72 years. By the way, planetary precession is going to pop in here in long world ages by Theorem 12. Here's another book that's in Dee's library. This is the Variable Mirafico. And so I'm going to give a little background on this and the relation between Christian Kabbalah to modern Kabbalah, especially those used in some initiatory societies, and then we will finally be to the first 10 theorems. So Johann Reuchlin writes this book. He also writes about preaching. He also writes a Hebrew grammar. He writes a book that is his most famous, The Art of Kabbalah, which I'll get back to in a moment. But he is taking a risk. Christian Kabbalah grows out of the Florentine Academy, and probably the most famous proponent of it, definitely before Reuchlin, is Pico della Mirandola. He's probably poisoned, and Reuchlin is Pico's student. So it's not the safest thing to be writing about. So we might ask, why are these Renaissance humanists bringing Kabbalah back in when they are in a bloodthirsty era where it is not really a safe thing to do? Reuchlin writes Liber de Verbo Mirafico in 1494. Like Dee, he addresses it to a famous patron, in this case, the Medici Pope, Leo X, one of the richest popes there's ever been and a great patron of the arts. Also someone who historians say was probably an atheist, but that is another story. So that's just 2 years after 1492, right? That is not a very good year if you're, say, a native person living in the Indies. It's the beginning of the great genocide of native people, and also the wiping out by disease. It's also not a very good deal if you're Jewish or Muslim and you live in Spain, because the Jews and Muslims were kicked out of Spain in 1492, whereas even a few decades before, they'd lived fairly harmoniously with each other. So one of the things that you might do if you're Jewish and live in Spain is, if you don't want to leave, you convert to Christianity. So Reuchlin is relying on Riccio, who, as I've mentioned, is one of those conversos. He was a Spanish Jew who converted to Christianity. So I still haven't talked about what the miraculous word is if it's not Yod He Vav He, because that's what we might think it is, right? That would make sense, but it's not that. So before I tell you what it is, think about what might spur the import of Hebrew into Hermetic and Neoplatonic thought. It's not a safe thing to be doing. No, it's probably safer to do this than to actually be Jewish, then, to be fair. That's why there are so many conversos, people who don't want to be killed and don't want to leave. But why bring Kabbalah into this Hermetic Neoplatonic tradition that is fomenting among humanists at that time? It's because there is this idea that magic in the medieval time period has just gotten to be messy, too far, too mixed up to even be any good. There are all these, here's how to do a spell. Here's how to bind this demon. Here's how to do an exorcism. I mean, there's plenty of magic that exists. But the idea being, if you're contemplating perfect forms and believe you're in a fallen world, this has just fallen too much to even be useful. So you're contemplating how to resurrect some of those forms to help heal the world. You probably know the Esoterica channel of Dr. Justin Sledge, by the way. He has a great video on this work. I'll put in fact, let me just put it in there, a link to it below. But he will argue, actually, Sledge argues that Reuchlin argues, and I agree with him, that all of magic can be reformed by returning to these primeval words of power. It's not only that let there be light, it's God said, let there be light. And so if you have the right words of power, and now you're going to have this new miracle-making word, it will transform all the philosophy of magic. What is that word? Yod, He. And you put in a sheen vav he. So let's look at Yod he sheen vav he. The tetragrammaton, Yod he vav he, is in effect becoming the pentagrammaton. The pentagrammaton is used in all manner of what kind of New Agey Christian videos. You can look that up yourself. But isn't there a problem if you are suddenly finding the name of Jesus in Hebrew Kabbalah? Well, no, not if you're a committed Christian, and all of these people are. So I want to describe this in terms of why they think it is so important, and kind of leave my thoughts at the door. I am not an apocalyptic Christian, by the way, if you want to know, but you need to understand this line of thought to see why the Christian Kabbalists do this. So in the Variable Mirafico, we get the implication that the power of speech is associated with the powers of creation. God said, let there be light, but it's been so watered down that it's just lost. In the Renaissance, they have looked to ancient Greek rhetoric and looked at how to speak, and looked at that as a sacred act, preaching. The concept of a good man speaking well, which is all through classical rhetoric, becomes via Christian rhetoricians like St. Augustine, but not only St. Augustine, there's Quintilian, there's a bunch of others, Thomas Aquinas. It becomes a good Christian man preaching the Gospels well. And some like Reuchlin, who appears to not know a lot of Greek, isn't happy with just the Latin Vulgate. Now, what Dee's solution to this is to go read the New Testament in Greek, but, Reuchlin is not Dee. On the other hand, Dee can't read Hebrew. It doesn't appear. It appears he can table Hebrew out Kabbalistically. So Yod He Vav He, Yahweh, becomes Yeshua, or Jesus, Yeshua. That's in one sense. In another way, there is this Christian tradition of looking at the Old Testament prefiguring the New Testament. So the law revealed to Moses becomes the New Testament covenant, the words of Jesus. So it's a very common Christian practice. This line of thought becomes revelatory and magical, because the divine word, these words that if you're a magician, you're going to vibrate, Yod, He, Shin, Vav, He, that kind of thing. They are part of your magic. As I've mentioned, the late medieval world just has vestiges of this per this line of thought, but that gives birth to, within the Jewish community, Kabbalah. And now, per this line of thought, if you are Christian, it gives birth to Christian Kabbalah. And Christian Kabbalah is not the same. How is it different? Well, the focus on Yod He Shin Vav He is like pretty big way. No Jesus in Rabbinic Kabbalah. You can only unlock it with the revelation of the word incarnate, Yod He Shin Vav He, with Jesus. So that word encompasses the promise of the covenant of the New Testament. All right. You see it all over in pictures. You just might not know what those pictures are. So here is a pentagram, right? This is a pentagrammaton. Yod, He, Shin, Vav, He. Why is Adam in here? Oh, prefiguring Yeshua. Here's another picture. This is from after D with Bohm. You've got that Tetrahedrons again in here, only with Yod He Vav He, and at the bottom Yod He Shin Vav He in the heart of Jesus. Okay, I am going to say a couple words about the art of Kabbalah, and then yes, I will finally get to the first 10 theorems viewed through the lens of Christian Kabbalah. So Reuchlin's The Art of Kabbalistica is in English translation. It's the book I just held up. I guess I'll keep holding it up, and you have it there on the screen. It's translated by Goodman and Goodman. There's 2 great introductions. You can actually read the introductions free online. I put in a link there. Now, one of the big issues, as I've mentioned, is people have said, scholars have said, that D couldn't know the Sefer Yetzirah. Actually, he was in the same place with Pustel. He certainly knew the Sefer Yetzirah, and he didn't have the so-called Kircher Tree of life, which we have already reverse engineered back a very similar tree in Risi. The reason there are not pictures in the art of Kabbalah is the kind of book that it is. It's a dialogue, just like in Platonic dialogues. In the Timaeus, it's the creation of the world through geometric forms. Do you have Plato drawing you out a nice little tetrahedron there, or a 2-dimensional projection of that? No. You're supposed to visualize it. And it's a dialogue, and you just have what people say. Well, the Variable Mirafico that I was talking about is another dialogue. It's a Christian guy talking to 2 others about this miraculous word. And in this one, we have 3 speakers, a Pythagorean, an Arab, and a Jew. I know it sounds like a joke. A Pythagorean, an Arab, and a Jew walk into a bar, and what do? They talk about Kabbalah. Simon the Jew teaches the other 2 about the art of Kabbalah. Reuchlin draws from his Hebrew studies the Latinized translations I've mentioned, and he has others he's drawing from. How do we know this? Because they come up in the conversation here. In other words, if you read Latin, or thanks to this translation, if you read English, you can see the rabbinic Kabbalists that Simon the Jew is talking about. He mentions a lot of them, especially Spanish Kabbalists, including Gikatiya's teacher, Abraham Abulafia. So we can be pretty certain this is the tree he's talking about. Now, one of the goals of Dee's great synthetic project here is to bring you, all of these have come from the one in this big hermetic egg, or from the sun and the moon creating the one. So the restoration of that is going to direct us to the book of Revelation by the time we get to the end of this. But we are also merging that with the highest Platonic idea, the return of the good, the bonitatis, and the Gnostic ascent of the one. This sounds a lot like the Tikkun Olam that most people associate with Rabbi Isaac Luria, a great Kabbalist. But as I've also pointed out, it can't be Luria yet, because at the time that Dee is writing the Hieroglyphic Monad, Isaac Luria is still in Egypt. He's going to start his work in Safed not long after this. By the time Dee and Kelly are in Prague, word of Luria's work may have come into the Prague Jewish community, but that's 2 decades from now. But the idea of repairing the vessels is not unique to Luria. If you don't know what the idea of repairing the vessels is, let me explain. There's the idea that there's this lightning flash, the tree is formed, the vessels are perfect, but then as part of the fall, they shatter. Tikkun Olam is the restoration of the shattered vessels to restore humanity, in effect. It's a beautiful, beautiful concept. So that meshes very well with contemplating sacred forms, so that you can get as close as possible to them in the fallen world, restoring the good, the Gnostic ascent of the one, all these things. But it can't be Luria. Well, the idea isn't new with Luria. What's new with when you get to Luria is the way he discusses it. In fact, you can tell Lurianic Kabbalah is sexualized, for example. And the same thing that translates that later in Lurianic Kabbalah and the Art of Kabbalah, Simon the Jew is at pains to say, oh, that's what they're doing with Bo and so on. It's a bad translation. No sex in Kabbalah. I think that's Reuchlin basically protecting himself. But anyhow, as an example, in the Art of Kabbalah, the Pythagorean asks Simon, what is revealed by the Art of Kabbalah? What's so special about it? And Simon says, none other than the universal restoration after the primordial fall of the human race. Wow. And that sounds almost exactly the same as Tikkun Olam. That the idea exists. Lurianic Kabbalah's specific manifestation of it isn't something Dee would have known of. But he would know, for example, this. Also, another way we know that Dee read on the Art of Kabbalah is some of the Hebrew Dee uses is right out of there. For example, remember in the letter to Maximillian, Gematria, Notericon, and Tumura. Okay, Gematria is a term pretty well known. The other two are known in different places. But if you are obsessed by origins as Dee are, well, where are the places people talk about that? Well, the Art of Kabbalah. So we can be 99.999 certain Dee knows the Art of Kabbalah, which introduces him. Working backwards to the Porta Lucius, he's traveling around, including in Italy, places where it would be easy to read a copy. So let's look at the tree here. Now, this was the Kircher tree, the one we reverse engineered back to the one I just showed you. And what I didn't talk about in that video was all of these other things in each sphere, all these Hebrew other emanations related to the major emanation of that Sephira. One of the things that Kabbalah also works well at is a mnemonic device. What are all of the things associated with, say, Yesod, this Sephira, which will be quite important here in a moment? Well, you can go online and you will eventually or quickly see the problem. Watch this. This is from a site that's a pretty good site. I just snipped it because it's the first one I found. All of these associations with each of the 10 Sephiroth here, Malkuth, Yesod, Hod, same ones we've seen drawn out in that tree pattern. So, well, okay. The element, maybe, the image. Well, wait a second. The chakra, isn't that a concept from like another place on? How did that get mixed in here? In fact, you'll find associations with Hebrew gods and goddesses. Now, I'm not saying there's anything at all the matter with that if that's what you're doing. I am saying for the purposes of looking at the hieroglyphic monad, all of those associations are not going to be helpful until you understand the whole monad. So the ones that may be helpful, especially if you have already studied Hermetic Kabbalah, and some of you watching this I know have, is any of them that involve Hebrew, like associating particular paths with Hebrew letters. Now here we have the side paths, which Riccio, for example, doesn't draw in these cross paths. But those superimposing those kinds of things isn't going to cause you a great deal of trouble. But then you'll get, tarot attributions on the path. Great, fascinating study. I love it. It's not relevant to studying Dee. That's not something that there's no evidence that that's something that would have been interesting to him. So the more that you keep your associations to things that you find in translations that are around in Dee's time or things that are in Hebrew, the better. Here's the way that the first associations or names of the Sephiroth, and a name is an association, that you have in Riccio's translation of Gikatia. And you'll see if you have studied Kabbalah that some of them are identical, like Kether is Corona, the crown, or Hokmah, wisdom. When you come over here to Bina, prudence. Down here to Tiferet, beauty. This is what will be associated with Adam and then replaced with Yeshua, but who's prefigured by Adam. And this will also encompass the surrounding Sephirah. Now, if this is starting to sound familiar to some of you, bear with me, it'll start sounding a lot more similar if you have studied Hermetic Kabbalah, one of the most common ways that people study Hermetic Kabbalah now. But if you work, it's working through in that way that Kircher, we know this, we're not speculating because Kircher talks about it for pages and pages and pages. It's how Kircher comes up with these associations. I said there were some of you this was going to seem awfully familiar to. Well, one of the most common ways that people outside of Judaism started studying Kabbalah was the Hermetic application of Christian Kabbalah, if that makes sense. And here I'm just snipping pages from Israel Regardie's 1937 work, The Golden Dawn, because most of the people who study this and have initiations based around it are spin-offs of the original Order of the Golden Dawn, as is Regardie, by the way. This is the Stella Matutina. But anyway, you see here the lightning flash. You see the same numbers. There are the paths that I mentioned you don't have in Gigatia, and these side paths, but everything else is awfully similar. And the flaming sword, didn't we hear about that in the letter to Maximillian? Why, yes, we did. And most of the things that you study in your knowledge lectures related to Hebrew, like if you were supposed to do something like memorize the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the numbers associated with them, and you're doing this, but you really don't plan to take a trip to Israel in the near future, you're not Jewish and you're not trying to speak or read Hebrew, but now the next thing you're studying is how to write out different things like Malkuth with Hebrew letters, then probably everything you studied that has to do with Hebrew will apply directly to the hieroglyphic monad. I'll have a whole video of Golden Dawn correspondences to the monad when I finish this course. But my whole theory is that's where this stuff in these Golden Dawn spinoffs came from when you're studying divine names attributed to the Sephiroth. In fact, Raziel shows up in Art of Kabbalah, and he's the one who has taught them. That's angelic revelation. That's angel magic. Planetary names, why do you have to write them in Hebrew? Because you're going to attribute them to the Sephiroth, because of the power of the spoken word, and so on. And all of these things you'll go through, you can apply to the hieroglyphic monad. Now, how about if you have drawings like this of the tree of life? That's the cliff off down there, by the way, which we talked about when we were talking about shades in an earlier video. Maybe someone going through an initiation saw a picture like this and thought, hey, didn't Kabbalah come from the Jewish tradition? Why is this Jesus in the middle? But by then you have other sacrifice gods, actually, like Osiris. And so, great. You can project backwards and some of these drawings that you look at are directly in the monad. You get Zawar Anpin not used, but this is the attribution that you're going to get of the microprosopis and atom. You're going to unfold a cube at one point. Gee, didn't we do something like that in Theorem 8? And you get a cross, and then later you're going to get a cross that has 10 squares. Then you're going to get one that has 12 squares. Then you're going to put one, you're going to have this truncated pyramid. Whoever put these together understood the hieroglyphic monad. In fact, this symbol of Venus on the tree of life directly out of the hieroglyphic monad. So are many other things there. Okay, moving on, but I just wanted to make that point because the attributions that D makes in the monad fit hand in glove with those made by spin-offs of the Golden Dawn or the Stella Matutina. All right, we're finally to the first theorems again. Let's go through. So Theorem 1 we talked about. This is God saying, let there be light. Pure forms are produced in light. So you have the Ein we're talking about in Christian Kabbalah. Ein Sof, Aur. Sometimes they're spelled differently depending on who transliterated Hebrew when and whether it was Sephardic or Ashkenazi and so on. But So Ein is, this is not the tree. This is above the tree, getting ready for the lightning flash. The lightning flash hasn't happened yet. You have nothing. Then you have limitless nothingness. And then you get a contraction, and the Ein Sof emanates the Sephira into the cosmic womb, and the universe is created. And that is Ein Sof Aur, sometimes written now as Or Ein Sof, but limitless light can flashing and creating the tree. So, Theorem 2, the piercing first creation, Stilbon, Mercury. That piercing first creation is light coming in and creating the spheres, if it's the Timaeus, the Sephiroth, or the emanations of God, if it's the Kabbalah. And you are going to have the first one now, Kether. 3, creation is going to start manifesting. In the first extension of light, you have the 3 supernals. If you have that Aries thing at the top of the tree, you can also see a kind of implied 3 supernals there. You can also get an implied Ein Sof Ur, and then the dot that is now at the top here is Kether. And they flash and create the middle pillar, Kether, Tiferet, Yesod. They don't create Malkuth yet, but through one understanding of the lightning flash, you have this first flash that creates the middle pillar and then creates the side paths that flashes out because of the polarities. And then you have Malkuth created last. So here at 3, the remarkable central point of the hieroglyphic monad refers to Earth is that, this is the point that was in the middle here that was punctured and through which the universe creates, also the monad symbol of the Pythagoreans. So is it Malkuth yet? No, not yet. Is it the element Earth, which is only mixtures? No, not yet. What is it yet? Earth at first is the entire monad, all of creation. Same as in the cosmos in the Timaeus. The universe is forming. That's the symbol of the whole universe in Pythagoreanism. Now soon that will just be D's sun. So by 4, you have this interesting thing about the moon seems to regard, this is the moon, and this symbol now is the sun. She seems to rejoice in the shape and in being near the sun. Why on earth would that be? Well, we flip the monad, and now we know there's a lightning flash, it is the tree, and it becomes a little bit clear. If this is Yesod, Yesod is receiving the light from Tiferet, which is above it. Before, the way we looked at it was simply that, well, we know that the sun, the moon reflects the light of the sun, and they knew that then. But specifically, the reason that Yesod is always going to turn the light up to Tiferet is that's where Yesod gets divine life and divine light. And when Yesod doesn't do that, Yesod disappears. It's not, it starts to fall apart. Okay, so we have first light, the word of God, which was let there be light. Oops, there's misspelled. Sorry, I'm not going to do this a third time, but the Old Testament Tetragrammaton has become the New Testament Pentagrammaton. And that is the first light of the philosophers. Yod He Shin Vav He. First light is Yeshua. So Theorem 6, this was the theorem where we went through flipping the monad in a variety of different ways. We had this cross here that was one of the ternaries. The middle point was displaced. The displaced point can later be up here, but we also had a quaternary. So there were these 4 rectilineal crosses. They flip out and you have a square. The square flips again. You have a cube. You have a hidden octad in there. So we were looking at it in terms of Pythagorean forms, especially those related to the hexahedron or cube, and how that connects to the cross. What happens here if the monad is flipped? Well, let's review what the ternaries are. We have Ein, Ein Sof, and Ein Sof Aur is a very important ternary, top of the tree. The 3 supernals, Kether, Chokmah, and Bina. Those are associated with the lightning flash. That matches the Pythagorean cosmogenesis as you have a fire triangle. When you have 4 triangles put together, you get the Platonic solid, a tetrahedron associated with fire. So since that's 4, now we have a link to the quaternaries, the tetragrammaton, and 2 groups of 4 Sephiroth, which I'm going to show in the next slide when we get a tree of life back here again. And the displaced center point is a pentagrammaton. If you have been through some sort of initiation where there is a crowning point of spirit lifted from the cross of the elements, this is where that's coming from in Christian Kabbalah. And we'll see that directly in another theorem in the monad also. Also, Tiferet, the 6th Sephirah, is a lower octave of Kether. It's associated with the cross and the cube and much more. This is also the first Sephirah where if you've already studied Kabbalah, you get an idea of, well, something he said Kabbalistically, and this seems to be associated with Tiferet, but I don't know why. More on that in a moment. Theorem 7 was the one on magical flux, where we talked about how in the world of motion, you never can step into the same river twice. Everything is changing. 7 has this mystical connotation because, among other things, there are no 7s if you look at characteristics of Platonic solids in the world of forms. There's not on any of the Platonic solids a 7 until you do something, well, I'll just say something kind of mystical. Outflowing of a point. This is the dew, if you're looking at this in terms of physical alchemy, which, as I've said, I'm not. It also can be associated with different rivers, including some biblical rivers. So you get another reference back to quaternary and ternary that way if you're a biblical scholar and want to do that. I'll also mention that the Contraries are from Paracelsian medicine, which is enjoying a renaissance, all puns intended, in Dee's time. When he was lecturing in Paris, for example, Paracelsian medicine was really in vogue. So the idea of these contraries that go out, well, they're balanced in the middle, in the same way that if part of your body is sort of thrown out this way, you balance it by putting in some of the contrary from this way. That's just a basic tenet of Paracelsian medicine. Also, in the Timaeus, everything is superimposed on the human body explicitly. And many people have explicitly superimposed Sephiroth onto the body, whether that's a good idea or not. I mean, talk to the person you're studying Kabbalah with. I'm not jumping into that. But in Gikatilia's tree, as portrayed by Riccio, they're also flowing into Yesod. So all of these things are flowing into Yesod. Let's get Riccio's tree. There we go. All right. There are these contraries, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, mystical 7, there is Yesod. All the contraries are coming into Yesod. We don't have cross paths. We have everything flowing first into Tiferet, if it's the upper part of the tree, and below Yesod. I also said I'd point out quaternaries here, the ones that are associated with that cross, 1, 2, 3, 4. But down here it will be 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, Theorem 8. This is the one where D makes such a big deal about where the letter X falls in the Latin alphabet. And we realize that what he is doing is, most obviously anyway, referring to the idea that making letters is another contemplation of sacred form. So with a compass and straight edge, you should be able to draw every letter. But then he's going to flip that into a cone, and this will presage stuff he does with conic sections in later theorems, particularly Theorem 17. But the Kabbalistic expansion of the quaternary produces the denary. Well, yes, 1, 2, 3, 4 equal 10. But do you see, if you number it this way, instead of the usual 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's even easier to refer it to Kabbalah. And what do you have here at 5? The pentagrammaton in the middle of the denary. Okay. The Kabbalistic expansion of the quaternary can also refer to, and it's something discussed by Reuchlin in the Art of Kabbalah, the four worlds of Kabbalah, where you associate each of the four worlds with Yod, He, Vav, He. Well, you associate one letter of the Tetragrammaton with each of the four worlds. So in Asaya, which would be referred to Malkuth, the physical world that you're in, take in that, just in that Sephira, you would have 10 more denaries, 10 more Sephiroth. In the same way that a tetractys can contract and expand because it's fractal. This isn't exactly fractal, but you can conceive it as the same thing. Every Sephira has within it 10 sort of mini Sephira and so on. Sometimes it's shown like this, Yod, He, Vav, He. Just ignore the colors. I didn't feel like removing them from my graphic. By the time we get to 9, we're really suspecting this is going to refer itself to Yesod, if we've had any training in Kabbalah at all. So this corresponds very well with the sun and moon of our monad. All right, and the sun and moon of the Emerald Tablet giving birth to the one thing. And the exact separation is made of their lines. Oh, like in the tree of life. Therefore, by means of the circular motion of their lines. Now, we talked about that with the rectilinear cross and how in the Timaeus, with this cross, you have each part of it connecting and making circles, and that implies spheres, and spheres are the perfect form in the Timaeus. You have here also the idea, though, that since these are emanations of powers of God, they're going to form a sphere, although no, Sephira doesn't mean spheres, but you can superimpose that concept of a sphere. A conjunction of the circle will be made in the solar complement. The solar complement, that is Yesod. The middle pillar, if you are in balance, is pouring into Yesod, which is sometimes called the treasure house of images, by the way. The idea that something exists there in concept, invisibly, until it is manifest into the physical world. So by visualizing this act of creation as just the same as when you visualize perfect forms in the Pythagorean cosmos, you start to redeem the world. At least that is the line of thinking that Dee is describing here. In Lurianic Kabbalah, that will become the Tikkun Olam. But for Dee and Christian Kabbalists like Reuchlin, it becomes, at least in part, the promise of the Christos, the promise of Jesus, or whatever you associate with the Christos, if you're in Hermetic Kabbalah, redeeming the world and resurrecting the kingdom. So that brings us back to Theorem 10. We've gone through it quite a few times now. We don't need to do it again, but from this point forward, we're going to be dealing with the monad glyph right side up, but in the world of flux, where things are constantly changing. Time, or the fallen world, has begun. We're going to look at lots of time measures. Fire, just like in physical alchemy, will rise through the bottom, rise up from the bottom. These biblical references that have been mainly to Genesis are going to start to shift towards Revelation. You'll start to get allusions to Revelation as soon as Theorem 12. The world has formed. The world is fallen. So to improve the world and make it better, we start contemplating those things that still exist as perfection somewhere other than Malkuth. So we'll start with the first day in the fallen world at 1/12 of 1/12, the dodecatomorion of Aries, which begins the spring equinox. So as far as your homework, I don't know how much you know about Christian or Hermetic Kabbalah. If you're interested in D, probably some, but if you don't know anything about it, or you just want to brush up on it, please do that. I'll tell you how particular things work, but you want to be visualizing these yourself and understanding them yourself. Before I recommended Colin Lowe's Hermetic Kabbalah, you can look through knowledge lectures in that, link to Regardi if you want to. Here's also a site, Digital Brilliance, that's associated with Colin Lowe's work. If you really want to take a deep dive on the Art of Kabbalah is in translation. You can get it. But the next class on Theorem 11 will be very, very short, I promise. Thanks a lot. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.